at the Willis Towers Watson event. No dig there or intended. Ooh, there we are. So anyway, without any further ado, I'm going to first of all introduce you to Henry, and Henry will give us sort of set the scene, and then Massey will take over. We'll open the chat up, so if you can put any comments in the chat or any links, please do. If you want to ask a question, raise a hand. Henry and I will bring you in the usual fashion. But Henry, over to you, and thanks in advance, Massey and Marita, for your time this morning.
Okay, without too many introductions, Marita is the lady with the numbers, and Massey is the guy with the strategy. We've been sent in lots of questions, mainly from Andy Young, we all know, or most of us know, but also from various other outposts that couldn't get in today. And I'm delighted that people did get to where they wanted to be this morning, because we've had a huge storm here in London. We've had a massive fire at London Bridge, and the trains and tubes aren't running. So if you were thinking of having a complicated day entailing lots of travel, turn home, turn on your computer and stay on it for the next hour. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Massey, a good friend of ours.
Right. Hi, thank you, Henry, and thanks everyone for attending, and hopefully we can have a lively discussion. I'm always a bit nervous about answering any questions, but I'll try and answer them, shall we say, rather than necessarily.
You're going to have to answer some questions.
Promise to answer all of them. But thanks in advance for those who have sent some questions in advance. I thought actually I'm going to assume everyone knows what a CDC is, but if someone desperately needs me to go through like a quick intro, just give us a shot and I'll do that. But some of the questions that were coming through, what we often find is there's confusion between when we say CDC, what do people mean by that? So there's a confusion between single employer CDC, multi-employer CDC, and retirement only CDC. So there's all CDCs, and they're all very good CDCs, but they are quite three different things. So let's start off within that split between single employer and multi-employer, and why is this important? Now, as the name would imply, a single employer CDC is just one employer and they create their own CDC. A good example of that is the Royal Mail CDC scheme. So that's a good example of single employer. Multi-employer is more akin to sort of a master trust where you have lots of different employers all joining the CDC. They typically don't get a say on what the CDC benefit structure looks like. So they buy into the benefit structure, and there's usually, it's like, well, we'll see, usually no one's set one up yet, but our expectations will be that it'll be pretty much the same structure of benefits for everyone. You don't really get a choice. But the features are the same, that you have, defined contributions. There's no risk. The employer takes on no risk in both cases. And the other key feature of the UK CDC system, and this is really, really important, is that once a year, the actuary does a valuation and it resets the pension benefits in line so that the assets equal the liabilities, so the present value of the future benefit that they're targeting. Why is this important? Because it means that it stops the buildup of any surplus or deficit within the pension system, and therefore that avoids the need effectively for someone to step in and provide the guarantee. This is in contrast to what we see perhaps in places like the Netherlands, where there is a bit of a buffer that gets created, and we can go into what that means later on. But that's the first, sort of key feature of it. I think what we see, with the Royal Mail, which is an example of a single employer's CDC, is that as a single employer, you get to design the benefits the way you and the labor representative like them, right? So the Royal Mail is a great CDC scheme, and it was designed for specific needs of what the Royal Mail needs to do. But it's probably not the template for what a multi-employer CDC will look like. So one key feature of the Royal Mail CDC is that the benefit structure looks a bit DB-like. It is every year that you're at the Royal Mail, you accrue a certain amount of a certain percentage of your final average salary. So it's a bit DB-like in that. But what that means, though, is that in effect there is a cross subsidy between the younger members and the older members. So, for example, if Marita and I were in the scheme and we work for 1 year, clearly I'm a lot older, and therefore the 1 year of, even if we're earning the same salary, the 1 year of accrued benefit should cost more for Massey than for Marita, who has many more years to go. But in reality, we accrue the same benefit, okay, for the same contribution rate. And so that's not good or bad. That's just the way it was designed, and that is the way the Royal Mail has approached. In a multi-employer CDC, you won't be able to do that. It's illegal to create these cross subsidies between the younger members and the older members. So that it has to be what we expect to find is that either the benefits will accrue differently for every age, but basically every pound that I put in or pound Marita buys, we will buy a certain amount of income, however that is calculated, but it will be a different amount of income, or at least we have to pay for that the same amount of income for at a different price. So you're not going to have this benefit structure which is DB-like. It'll be more DC-like, and that's actually a good way of thinking of the big difference between a multi-employer CDC and a single employer. Single employer is probably going to go from DB to DC. That's a sort of typical structure. We've seen that in the Netherlands, that approach, as opposed to a multi-employer, the Master Trust CDC, which is probably going to say, how does a DC scheme work? How do we adapt that for CDC land? So things will accrue on a separate part, and so that age cross subsidy won't really exist. I mean, the other thing that we need to consider, I'm moving on to one of the questions was, right, well, what are my thoughts on, should we set up a single employer, multi-employer? It depends, but it's really costly to set up a CDC. It not just up front, the obviously setting up of a new scheme and then rules, etc. But on an ongoing basis, the maintenance of a CDC is going to be more expensive. You have an actuary who has to come in and value the scheme once a year. The administration of a CDC is more DB-like than DC-like, even in a multi-employer, because you have to keep track of the pension that's accrued, for example. So there's a kind of commercial cost to setting one up, and that's why I think most employers will probably go down the multi-employer CDC route, even if they're probably actuarially are big enough to do a single employer DC. The second point, which is what I've just touched on, is the actuarial consideration. You need a certain number of individuals within the CDC to kind of make the longevity pooling work. My actuary friends typically say about 1,000. I mean, that's kind of a rule of thumb. That's probably a bit too small, and probably it's several thousand, I would say, to get it going, to make sure you have that pooling. There's also the need for the investment pooling, one of the benefits of the CDC. And so you just need a certain amount of assets there, or a line of sight of where the assets are coming from to get that scale. So I think they're quite different beasts, and I think the Royal Mail is been really helpful that has launched in the UK, because we can point to a CDC that exists, but it's also probably not the template for the multi-employer CDCs. I think they're going to look differently. The other thing is retirement only versus whole of life CDC. That's the other dynamic. Whole of life CDC, as the name implies, is we contribute to it and we build up a target income, and at retirement we have a choice. We can either take the target income or take our lump sums and do whatever it is we want for just like a DC scheme. A retirement only CDC is essentially, you probably end up having a traditional DC in the accumulation point, and then at retirement you use that pot to buy into a retirement CDC, almost like an annuity. Think of it as an enhanced annuity with a bit of risk around the target pension. That's the way to think about it. So the way those will be designed, and the benefit of the outcome of each of those is going to be slightly different. And I think if anyone has heard me, I'm quite a vocal supporter of the whole life CDC, because I think the big benefit that members get is in that accumulation bit where it allows you to stay on risk for longer, and I feel that you're likely to get better outcomes from a whole life CDC than a traditional DC and retirement only CDC. But I can see why the retirement only CDC exists, and we can debate that if anyone would has some questions on that.
Why don't we do a quick poll here? Yeah, those people who would prefer a whole of life, raise your hands now by using the raise button above above the faces. So I'm going to see that. Let's see how many we've got. 12, 13, 14. Ooh. I think we're pretty well there, yeah?
Right, great. I've convinced you all. We can all go home.
No, but there are clearly people out there who are as yet to be convinced, or who may be adamantly against. So we'll see. Thank you very much indeed for that snap poll.
That's great. And Henry, I'm happy now maybe just to answer some of the questions sent in or answer specific questions that people have. But I thought I'd just sort of kick that off with that difference.
I've got 3 hands raised still,
Great.
4 hands raised. Does any one of those 4 people want to answer a question, or will they take them down? Okay. Terry Pullinger adamantly staying in there with his hand up. Terry, you had a bit of a say in how things were done when you were at Royal Mail. Have you got a question? What you heard?
I just wanted to disclaim this before Terry asks a question. So whatever Terry says is actually more valid than anything I say, because he's actually done it. So let's go with that, Terry.
Well, thanks for that, but it may not sound like it when you get me questions. So, yes, I was the lead negotiator for the CW on the Royal Mail scheme, and we were deliberately designing it around exactly the same design as the DB scheme. So, as well as the CDC wage for life element, there's also a money purchase element, which builds up your lump sum that you would traditionally get, the 25% tax-free in a DB scheme. So that's that scheme. I'm slightly confused, so I might say, love me, I'm thick here, but in regards to what you're saying with a multi-employer CD scheme, wage for life CDC scheme. So the cross-subsidy bit, there's two elements to it I want to ask you about. One, if you're not having a surplus or a deficit, then presumably you could end up, and I think, at my understanding, with a greater return on your investment, the money you're paying into it, than the promise of perhaps, RPI or CPI or whatever increases, because the surplus has to go to the people, yeah? Equally, it's the generational thing I'm not sure of, other than, of course, when people are retired and they're still getting increases because it's a wage for life. But if in a multi-employer scheme, this is my sort of simple, someone comes in, so Henry, has got a much better job than me and his employer, he comes in and he's paying, I don't know, the employer's paying 14% contribution, Henry's paying 9% contribution, but my employer, I'm only paying, 7% contribution, and my employer's paying 7% contribution. The calculation is there's a wage that Henry's buying, and there's a wage that I'm buying. So when Henry's, both of ours would be subject to CPI increases or better if there's a surplus, how you divvy that up. I don't understand where the generational bit crossover comes in that, why that's detrimental to somebody else, because if it's based on what your starting point is and you get your increases on CPI, why is that a problem to you? Why is that a generational problem?
In a multi-employer, there isn't that cross subsidy. So that, just to be clear about it, I think it exists in the Royal Mail, in the single employer scheme, but a multi-employer, it just, one, it's illegal to do, so let's not do it. But the way the mechanics would work is essentially, in your example, what the benefit that Henry would accrue versus, let's say, what you would accrue is not necessarily linked to direct. It's not just his salary. It's basically how much money has Henry contributed, whatever, wherever that came from, maybe the employer, the employee, it doesn't really matter. There's a stock. Let's say Henry has put in £400 and you've put in £100. So what the multi-employer CDC scheme will do and say is, how much does that £400, how much pension does that £400 buy? Clearly more than £100, but we have to take into account Henry's age. Now, I don't want to embarrass anyone. Let's use Henry and Marita in this case. In this way, we don't embarrass anyone. So Henry's clearly older than Marita. Therefore, the £1 of pension that Henry is going to buy is going to be more expensive than the £1 of pension Marita may buy. So he's £400. Let's, for argument's sake, to keep the math simple, and say that the cost of £1 of pension is twice as much for Henry as it is for Marita. So his £400 would buy, let us say, perhaps £20 of pension, while Marita's £100, even though it's 1/4 of that, may buy £10 of pension because it's less. So, Terry, to your point,
yeah, I think. Sorry, I
it doesn't.
I think that if you're talking to someone, if we're trying to get someone into a pension scheme,
yeah,
that doesn't really compute. That's what I'm saying. Not to me, because the point is, if Henry comes in now, and by the way, you won't embarrass Henry because I'm older than Henry, but my point is if, and it wasn't, where Royal Mail one is based on the wage that they receive in each year and a percentage of the wage, so that contribution goes up. This isn't. This is like the contribution made at the start is the pension you're buying, yeah, that grows, as we say, with CPI or more if there's surplus. So if we're setting up that scheme tomorrow, and Henry joins, and I join on the same day. Let's say we're making both making the same contribution. I'm going to end up with a better pension than Henry because I've got more years in it, haven't I?
Hey.
I've got more years. I've got more years. I could have 30 years before I take my pension, where Henry might be taking his in 5. So I'm going to have, mine's going to be better, isn't it?
Yes, because you contributed for 30 years and Henry only 5, so it should be bigger.
Yeah.
So what is the big beef then with people about cross subsidy, or someone's going to have less or more?
No. There's what I'm saying is in a multi-employer, your amount of pension you get is entirely based on how much you contribute and when you contributed. Right. That's it. So there's no accruals. The cross subsidy in the Royal Mail occurs because it's linked to the years of service and your salary. So to give you the example, if Marita and I both worked for the Royal Mail for 5 years, just for argument's sake, we would land up with the same pension, even though in reality the Royal Mail pension scheme would have earned, they would have had my money for just maybe 5 years and Marita's for 20 years. So clearly Marita's overpaying for her 5 years of service versus Massey. So that's the issue. And that's what you can't do it in a multi-employer, because what you don't want to start doing is creating cross subsidies between employers. So an employer turns up with lots of old people, another one with lots of young people. You'd have that, within one scheme, you can make a decision. That's fine. You can negotiate that. Within many employer schemes, you end up having these cross subsidies between them, which is not what the legislation wants you to do.
I suppose for me, it's just the message becomes negative rather than positive, because we've all paid into the NHS all our working life, and some of us have paid more than others, etc., and we all get the benefit. But we're all up for that because that's a good thing in our society, and wage and retirement pensions are massively important in our society. So it's just, it just seems like a negative on something that I think should be presented extremely positively.
I think I'm not a particularly good benefits communication specialist. I think the idea here is that when it gets launched, someone puts it together in language that people can understand much better than I can explain it.
Terry, you may be that man, right? But we have to move on because we've got some questions in the pipeline. So I'm going to shut you up now, which is a terrible thing to do on one of these talk things. I think you and Massey are on the same page. I can see there's stuff coming in the chat thing. I'm going to come on to that, but I think it's useful to get this early on. I said, what role is BlackRock going to have in all this?
Yeah, I mean, I think BlackRock likes to stick to its knitting. Like, we're good at managing money, and I think that's what we want to do. Our aim is really to be essentially two roles. One is obviously provide investment components for anyone setting up a CDC, as we do now in DC land. But I think we have ambitions to be OCO managers for, at least one, if not more, of the CDCs that get set up. And that's really where we see what we're very good at. And I can go into a whole picture of why we're good at it. But I think there's not just the investment capability, but also the investment infrastructure that we bring to this, which is really, really important when you set up a CDC. So things like being able to align the capital market assumptions, i.e. the forecasts that the actuary needs to work at discount rates directly with our investment strategy. We kind of build that around Aladdin. So there's a lot of that's what we focus on. So the short answer is we really want to focus very much on the investment side, OCO managers, and component parts providers. That's really where we see our role. So I'm afraid no big headlines coming from this presentation.
Well, we need to define what OCIO means.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Yes,
think most of us.
No, that's right. It's a very, very BlackRocky thing. Let me use the acronym. So OCIO is, what we mean by that is an outsourced CIO. So basically, when you set up a CDC, you will need not, unlike a traditional DC, where you can just say, hey, we will just be I set up a CDC with Marita, we be the CIOs, we define the asset allocation. You can go down that route, but it becomes very difficult because when you construct the portfolio, you need to align the assumptions that you're constructing the portfolio with the assumptions you've made to work out the pension benefits, and need to do that consistently over 30 years or 40 years or 50 years, however long you plan to run the CDC for. So I think the advantage there is to have a single coordinated approach to doing the asset allocation, and so that it's better aligned with the benefits. And that's really what we see clients do in the DB world, where we are appointed as the outsourced CIO. Of course, the trustees have oversight and ultimately make the decision, but they delegate the CIO role to a BlackRock, who then runs that as an open architecture business.
Is this a bit of a partnership? You mentioned partnership then, or is this we call the shots at BlackRock, or we're told what to do by the actuary?
Yeah, I think it's much more of a partnership, because basically the actuary's initial role is to design the benefit design, and then saying, right, if I want these kind of benefits, what does the portfolio look like that achieve these benefits? And that's where we see our role come in and say, well, it looks like this, and this is why. And there's a bit of a debate about some of the nuances around it, but fundamentally, it's much more collaborative, or it should be. If it doesn't, then please pick a different CIO. I think that would be the case.
Yeah. Okay. So there's got to be a bit of friendship between the actuary and the investment.
Yes, and some of our best friends are actuaries.
All right. So I suspect there may be some questions out there which I'm missing. So if you have got the question and I'm missing you, then stick your hand up. And I see some interesting chat there, but you're going to have to actually stick your hand up if you want to have something asked.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't see the chat, so I'm relying on Henry to shout out what's in the chat.
Okay, well, I have another question. Yeah, and this one comes from another source. And do you see CDC, which is something that's coming out of employers who've traditionally run DB schemes? Yeah. Or do you see it as primarily something from people who've just shoved their money into a master trust, and the employers are basically coming out of the master trust and doing this themselves?
Yeah. So over the last sort of, let's say, 9 months, I've probably had, I don't know, let's say somewhere between close on 50 sponsor meetings. Okay. Some of them have DBs, some of them have never had DBs. I think that it's clear, the one clear theme is this is not people saying, how do I replace a DB scheme with a CDC? That is not the message we get. It's almost universally, I think I've had one of those conversations. Everyone else is very much about, hey, we have a DC scheme, either in-house or on a multi-employer basis. We think that this could possibly be, sounds like we get more bang for our buck as an employer, and it's a better outcome for individuals. I'd like to know more about it. What is this about? So it's very much coming from DC to CDC rather than DB to CDC. So I don't think this is a catalyst for closing down DB schemes to replace by CDC. I don't think that's what the multi-employer CDCs are doing. It's very much, all the inquiries have been around an understanding that this looks like a better outcome for members, and how can they achieve that, and the feedback has been there's some sponsors who are really keen to go first and want to get out there quite quickly. Others are probably saying, look, we'd like to, but probably want to see it work first and be second movers, and then some are saying, well, not so much. Not so much for us. I think our members enjoy their freedom on how they pick their investments, etc. And if we want to stick where we are, or perhaps, we've just done a big DC exercise. We'll probably just maybe be third movers. So I think those are probably the camps we see it in. It's that move about that link back to DB. People get it quite quickly that this isn't just DB light. This is a better version of DC rather than a DB light.
I had an interesting question from one of the people I spoke to yesterday, who's got his, I'll say his, it could be his, her, because I want to be anonymous about this gender-wise. His, her said that there was well over £100 million worth of surplus in a DB scheme, and his, her wanted to know whether that money could be, over time, fed into a CDC scheme. Have you heard of any of that sort of thing going on, Massey?
I think it's I haven't, because we haven't had a multi-employer CDC yet, but I think it's probably a version of, we have a DB scheme and a DC scheme on the same trust. Can we move the surplus from the DB to the DC? So that's relatively easy for a sponsor to do. I think moving it from a DB into a multi-employer CDC, I mean, it's certainly possible, but it's more difficult because that'd be on two separate trusts. So, but I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, specifically, as a way to perhaps kickstart the CDC and start off maybe with slightly better benefits. I think that's worth doing. I mean, the usual issues that you need to think about, of course, are, who does the surplus belong to? I don't mean that as a legal question. I mean more, is it the employees who have been in the DB scheme, or is it the employees in the new CDC, which may not be the same people? How much of it should the sponsor have a say over? I think these are issues that you all know quite well. So I think that's so I haven't heard of that, the DB to CDC. I think it's more of a surplus extraction problem than a CDC question.
Yeah, I think the question that person, him and her, wanted to know was, have you heard of anyone doing this? Because it's an idea what we've had, and we wanted to have some validation of that idea. But you haven't given them the validation, but at the same time, you haven't taken it away.
No, I haven't heard it, but it's probably a conversation that they wouldn't have had with me. They probably would have had it with the DB advisors.
Yeah, the consultants and whatever. Yeah. Okay. There's a hand up. Terry, you're back. Quick one.
And then we got Peter.
Yep. Yeah, and then we got Peter.
So, all right. Sorry, but it's great to listen to you, and I agree with in terms of BlackRock and its approach to CDC, because obviously BlackRock is the investment manager for the Royal Mail scheme. And when we had to do the beauty parade, if you like, for who was going to get that job, it was evident that people have got to think differently about this. This isn't DC and it's not DB, so you've got to think differently. And there's a real risk that people revert to type. This is one of my problems with it. So when we start talking about CDC, It's a product in its own right, and it is a pension. DC isn't a pension. It's a savings scheme. What you do with it afterwards is a pension. And I think that distinction needs to be made by people in the industry and be honest about that, because ordinary working people, you're telling them they're in a pension, and it's not till the time that they draw it that they realise it isn't a pension at all, and they got all these decisions to make. So I think it's important to talk about CDC as a product in its own right, and that it is a pension the same as DB, or it's trying to create a pension for life, and DC isn't, because it isn't a pension. So that's one of the sort of points I want to make. Equally, I was just, before this call, I was on a Willis Towers Watson call talking about CDC as if it's being progressive, but all it's talking about really is at the decumulation stage of a DC scheme, decumulation, right? That ain't good enough in the world of pension. People need to start saving now for their wage for life. So in terms of setting up a multi-employer scheme, where does BlackRock sit on it? Are they interested in getting involved in sort of setting up, a big multi-employer CDC? Because someone's going to have to make the first step, as Royal Mail did, because I genuinely believe build it and they will come, if you like, to use the film analogy. But so that was what I wanted to ask you.
So I think, first of all, the point you make that it's something separate and new, I think that's absolutely correct. And I mean, again, I won't relitigate the, or do the pitch on what BlackRock does in that space. But I think you're right that it's a different way of thinking, not only in terms of benefit design and what it actually is, as you point out, but also even our role as OCO manager, the way we manage money is not the same as the way we manage through DC, and it's also not the way we manage money for DB. It's just a different way now because it's a different benefit. Everything from some of the infrastructure and the plumbing that we need to get it done, all the way to the asset allocation and how we think about that. So I think that's a very valid point I forgot to make, and I think that's super important. In terms of BlackRock, I mean, I think, Terry, just to reassure you, there are many many organizations looking to set up a multi-employer CDC, and we've spoken to several of these, and so they're all very capable people. Honestly, they don't need me to hold their hands. I think I'd be surprised if by in the next 12 months we don't see 3 or 4 multi-employer CDCs coming to market. They will exist. I'm pretty confident about that. And I think that's why, I'm excited for it. One, because I think it's just a really good idea, and the other is obviously for us, for BlackRock, I think it's also an opportunity. We'd really like to get involved.
Right. Thank you. And Peter, we come to you now because you have got a question in there. Do you want to articulate that verbally, or do you want us all to look at your chat? I'm sure. Yeah.
The point I was going to raise was not actually in the chat, so I'll deal with that. It was going back to the attraction to employers. For the past 3 years, I've been introducing the concept of multi-employer CDC to a group of finance directors in the not-for-profit sector. They traditionally they are still providing GPPs, many of them on a contribution matching basis. And the recent legislation has sort of challenged that. And so they are very interested, and they're picking up the messages from the government, like CDC provides 60% more benefit for the same contributions. So up to Peter. I know that's up to 60%. They read that from the government saying they do. So if the government says it must be right. Yes, yeah, but no, the attitude like that. So they are very interested. One of the earlier players announcing that it was intending to do CDC has given presentations to that group and had a lot of feedback interest. So just to pick up on that point. The other point is that, yes, I think that it is more likely to be companies that are doing something other than paying the minimum auto-enrollment contributions that will be interested in CDC. I think and I hesitate to think what a CDC benefit on minimum auto enrollment contributions would produce. Perhaps you could make a comment on that.
Sure. I actually think, Peter, some of the most vocal supporters, certainly from a sponsor perspective, of the multi-employer CDC are actually not necessarily. I don't want to go into what they're contributing, but I think certainly, let's say the mass employers were probably employees that are on the lower income side. They've actually a lot of them are looking to support this. Because I think, well, we can debate, is it 40% better outcome up to 60%, 80? I mean, there's like, pick a number, I can come up with a way of justifying. But I think the general principle is that it's probably a better outcome. And I think that from a sponsor's perspective, I think there's sponsors who either see this as, look, this is probably the right thing to do, and there's support even for perhaps we can't necessarily afford to increase the contribution rate, but we can afford to provide a better benefit. Or sponsors are saying this gives us a better bang for our buck. Basically, for every pound we put in, the employee gets more. So this is kind of a similar type of argument. So I think I think that the range of our sponsors who are interested, it really varies, and it is each sponsor probably has their own view on why they want to do this or why they would support it. And I think it's a fact of both improving the benefits, but also just the practicality. If you've just gone through a whole exercise and finally got to a single employer, you've perhaps done several DC schemes and moved it onto a single DC master trust, I think it'd be a hard sell to say, okay, now quickly move to a CDC. I think it may take them some time to do so. But I think people who have a well-established DC, single employer, or already part of a master trust and are looking for a better benefit, I think those are the people we'll see doing the switch. I think providers of a multi-employer CDC probably need to think about how to make that transition as easy as possible. So the legislation about allowing bulk transfers is really helpful, but also just practically, how do you communicate? How can they support the sponsor in the communication? How, can they tee up that transfer just to make it as easy as possible for employees to move their money around? I think those are sort of some of the factors that we need to take into account.
Yeah, it doesn't work with group personal pensions. Yes, yeah.
No, I'm afraid I can't solve everything.
The other thing is, I think one of the significant factors will be industry peer group pressure.
Yeah,
if you're employing somebody with a particular skill, you're going to be at a commercial disadvantage in recruitment if you don't provide the same benefit.
Wow, what a great comment that is. I'm going to write that one down. Okay, so I do have another question which comes on exactly the point you raised there. So, and the question is, how important do you at BlackRock think that their bulk transfers will be in the growth of CDC? Because very famously now, you actually predicted that quite a high percentage of DC might be in CDC before too long. I'm not going to say how much because I don't want to get you into trouble with your media people, but I know that.
I'm already in trouble. But luckily I didn't put a timeline on it, so it could be in 100 years' time. No, I think the bulk transfer, I think, is really, really important because there's two elements to this. One is actually you can start off with money in the bank, shall we say, and it just makes life easier for the setup of a multi-employer CDC rather than start from zero. And you start off with some money there. The other is just, I think, more operationally, if you're the pensions manager and you got this legacy DC on the side and a multi-employer CDC, I mean, I think just from a operations perspective, it'd be great to be able to have a single, like, that is the thing. Most people will go with both. There will be people who want to stay behind, which is fine, and have a plan with that. But I think, to me, I think it's really great news that you're able to do that. We all know 97% of people go for the default. So I think this interest in how the money is managed, I think a lot of employees are looking to the sponsor and the pension scheme to really think more carefully about how they manage money and help them achieve that goal. So I think to me, it's good news.
Okay, so that that question is answered. Thank you very much to the anonymous questioner. Here is a question from an actuary. Yeah, I won't say more than that. You'll know it's an actuary because it's got a very negative slant to it.
Okay. If this is Shailen, I just want to point out that I went to university with Shailen. I know him. I'll go get back to him if he's giving me nasty questions.
No, it is not that one. I will. It says, when a CDC, when a master trust, DC master trust fails, it is almost certain to be bailed out by other master trusts, DC ones, because it's just a no obligation type thing and whatever. Is this going to be possible in CDC? Is that going to be one? I mean, I know that there is this thing called continuity.
Yep.
I'm not fully aware of it myself, so perhaps you can give us some.
I'm going to misquote the DWP, so apologies.
Yeah.
But I think something like 3/4 of the legislation, or whatever, a vast portion of the legislation is all about the continuity plan in the case of a CDC failing. So a very large proportion. Someone's actually thought about exactly this question in a lot more detail. But I think to answer the question simply, the expectation is that there will be more than one CDC around. So essentially, the one side effect of not having age cross subsidies, I don't really want to open that can again, but just the consequence of that is that it's much easier to transfer money across, because it's quite easy to identify what is the value of Mussie's pot and what is the value of Marita's pot without any penalties or whatever that you have to build into it. So in the event of a CDC failing, it'd be quite easy to move Mussie's pot to another CDC if it exists, or actually into a traditional DC, because it would literally be there's a bit of money there that belongs to Massey and then transfer. So that would be quite easy to do. I think the difference will be that perhaps the pension that I've been targeting under my existing multi-employer CDC, when I transfer to a different multi-employer CDC, may not be the same number. Okay, just because perhaps they've followed a different investment strategy, or they have a slightly different investment design. But in reality, a CDC's pension is never guaranteed anyway. It's always a target. But I think what you would know, that if they were to fail and you transfer across, you're getting fair value, actuarial fair value. You'd get the actual value of that benefit being transferred across to the other CDC. Before I forget, CDCs have to hold regulatory capital aside precisely to manage this process. In other words, there's a pot of money there that has to be held, pretty liquid. So in the event of something bad happening, it's supposed to fund the operational mechanism of transferring money from the failed multi-employer CDC to a different CDC.
Thank you very much, Massey. And I have to make a quick apology to Mr. Tingle. Because I did imply that CDC at retirement was a bad thing. And it's not my job to do so. And secondly, I don't actually believe it. Although I did put the thumb down on Willis Towers Watson, just because I always do. And I love Simon Eagle, and he's a great guy. And we love WTW, really. But we are the pension playpen, and we do have a slightly humorous side to what we're doing. So before WTW get too upset, have a laugh. Okay, we're out of. Oh no, thank goodness, Peter coming back. As I said that, put his hand up again. So what do you have to say, Peter? Oh, that's a wave. Is that a wave? Was that?
Nope.
Do you want
sorry, whilst I was putting my hand up,
yeah.
It was just it was something that occurred to me that thinking about it in the long term. BlackRock obviously are concerned with the investment of CDC schemes. Do you think there's a risk that in CDC the investment managers and such like will seek to target the investment policy to the assumptions used for the valuation of benefits in the long term, i.e. Sort of an equivalent of an LDI policy for CDC, rather than so that members' pensions, for example, don't suffer a decrease when market conditions would otherwise indicate it, or in fact perhaps the goals will change. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
That's a great question, actually. I don't think that the incentives are probably not there to do that. But I tell you why. If you have more than one multi-employer CDC around, I think members it'll be apparently quite transparent about what they're trying, how the pensions are going in terms of every year the pension increases, what are they? So you probably want to, there's a bit of a competitive element that will keep that in line. The other piece is if you actually do the sums, basically, if you work out what the investment return has to be to fund a certain pension at a CPI, increasing at CPI, you quickly pops out that just investing in effectively a gilt plus 50 basis point type return isn't going to get you there. You need a much more growth oriented strategy. So I don't think so. I mean, I think that what may happen is that let's say, for argument's sake, everyone gets older and you have a multi-employer CDC that effectively becomes a retirement-only CDC because there's no new members coming in. I'm just extreme example. At that point, when it becomes retirement-only CDC, as that part of the scheme gets older, so retirement-only CDC, even using Willis's number, it looks a bit more like a balanced fund is what they're invested in. But as that portion gets older, they may want to start locking in as much as possible as benefits. So perhaps that's when the LDI kicks in. I think I'm struggling to think of an example when a whole life CDC would actually do that. Maybe a portion of the assets, but I think it's a bit over-engineered, to be honest. I think the smoothing mechanism of the benefit design itself will do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of evening out the retirement income piece.
That sort of links into a point which is raised by Con, not Elspeth, but Con Keating. Yeah. And I don't know if you want to make it here or just let me mouth it. Shake your head if you want to mouth it. Okay. I mean, your question is you don't understand how a CDC scheme could get into such trouble as it would have to be deemed failing.
No, I think the question is a little more subtle. It's if we are going to talk about CDC schemes failing, then we need first to discuss and to understand how that failure may come about and what its consequences are. The variation is there are some quite subtle differences in there. The likelihood of a CDC scheme failing in the modelling I've done is actually very, very low. But I'd like to hear other people's ideas on how CDCs might fail, because it struck me when I read the legislation, the DWP's focus on scheme failure was, to put it mildly, totally over the top.
You're not alone there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think given that the benefit isn't guaranteed and it's deliberately reset every year, it's very hard to think of, like, criminal activity aside, how that leads to a failure of the scheme. I think, again, parking aside criminal activity, what could happen is, let's say the investment returns are poor for a very long period of time relative to other CDC schemes. I think what you may find is employers abandoning that multi-employer CDC and moving money to another CDC, and it gets to the point where it's just not sustainable. And I think that's probably not a failure, but you can see it coming type situation, and it would be at that point the CDC has to be closed. I'm thinking of something like perhaps the multi-employer CDCs loses a lot of its client base in terms of pension schemes coming in, and maybe it's dependent on one or two really big clients who then pull out. And at that point, it's just not viable anymore. But I agree with you. I struggle to imagine a realistic investment scenario where the CDC itself fails, as opposed to maybe just it's not commercially viable, or there's been a fraud or an administration catastrophe or something along those lines.
One thing, this is my question. I'm allowed to have a question. Okay, Colin, I'm sorry. I'll let you have yours first. Go ahead.
Well, there's a related question here, which is who gets to determine whether a member or group of members leaves? Is it the employer who can take out all of their members to some other scheme, or is it just the members who can make that decision? I mean, the way I read it, it could be either or, but has anyone spoken to lawyers about that?
I haven't spoken to lawyers, but I have a suspicion that the whole bulk transfer rules applies to CDCs as well, presumably. So if a sponsor decides to move from one multi-employer CDC to another, they may, they can't force you to, but it'll be by negative consent, effectively, to move across.
Well, I actually think I'm wondering
But maybe I'm
whether
wrong.
you
Happy
might
to-
get a multi-employer moving from a CDC to DC. And I'm not sure that that is covered by the bulk transfer rules, which are actually concerned with transfers to. Anyway, one for the
I'm plead
lawyers.
ignorance of that one. Don't know.
I will have a word with a few lawyers about that point.
Oh, great.
To you, Henry.
Haven't got that. Have we not? Have we no lawyers on this? It's most unusual. One thing that came to mind, and I would ask you about it. In master trust now, VFM is very important because that's how you can basically force consolidation of a DC scheme. Perhaps we can see VFM extend to CDC so that one which is consistently paying pensions below the level which is deemed acceptable for the contributions paid might be required to put their hands up and either put it right, option 1, merge with others, option 2, or 3, go into a sort of annuitization LDI type situation, action 3. Would that be fair? Massey, you know much more about these things than me.
I mean, I think I don't know that the details of the legislature to give you a straight answer. It sounds like I can see that being a plausible scenario. I mean, I think it's, again, I'd really prefer to defer to a lawyer on the call who could definitely opine.
We don't have it at the moment.
So we'll have to come back to you on that one. Yeah. I mean, I think that sounds like, certainly that is a more plausible scenario than something catastrophic happening all of a sudden. I mean, to me, these are all scenarios that, think about what would happen to a DC, why you'd close a multi-employer DC. I think those scenarios probably apply to a multi-employer CDC as well.
Okay, well, thanks very much indeed. And although he's gone now, I'd like to say thank you to Martin Tinkle for some very interesting questions. But he's back, the man with a sort of a whole hall full of people queuing up to get into CDC, Peter Cameron Brown.
Yeah, just a quick comment.
Okay.
Promising that. I just wondered, can the trustees of a CDC scheme sack the proprietor if they don't think he's performing?
I'm afraid there's a lot of these. I don't know. I think let's defer that to a lawyer. Don't know.
Okay.
Christos has got his hand up.
Christos, Christos. Oh, nice to see you.
I did vote for whole of life CDC, and I'm definitely in that camp. But I'd like Massey's views on potentially targeted retirement CDC for two types of, first the cohort that is 55 to 64-year-olds that are not going to have a lot of time to get the full benefit of whole of life CDC, and then secondly, smaller pots, not small pots, but smaller pots where self-management doesn't really work very well, and pooling does look like it's a better option. And on that point, I'd be curious if BlackRocks has done any modeling to draw the threshold of where that line is, where the self-management no longer, and all these freedoms that we are supposed to be benefiting from, actually at some point, they're not freedoms in the sense that they don't really make much difference anyway, once you're below a certain threshold.
Yeah, I mean, so we haven't done much modeling yet. I think it's probably something we will be looking at. I think what we're waiting for on the retirement income CDC is just a bit more clarity about how the market will shape up in terms of how those benefits will be designed. I think we talk about retirement income CDC as if it's like, well, obviously everyone knows what we're saying, but I don't think that's true. So things like, are you going to, is there going to be underwriting? Because if I can make the case both ways. No, let's not underwrite the lives going into retirement income because it's just too difficult and it undermines the whole simplicity of it. But on the other hand, someone who has a real a significant life impairment may benefit from underwriting, and therefore perhaps an annuity is actually like an enhanced annuity is a better option, or perhaps not even that, just doing a drawdown, or just it may be the best thing. So the short answer is like, I think this, when is a retirement income good, and is there a segment that is better for than others? I struggle with that because I'd like to know a bit more about what do we mean by retirement income. Your point about, is it worth having a retirement income? Yes, I think so. I mean, I think to me, a lot of people, as the cohort you mentioned, if I've not had much time before retirement, I probably fit into that camp. I think if I look at my peers, they are asking for what sounds a lot like a retirement income CDC. Hey, I'm going to have this traditional DC. I'm going to land up with a pot. How do I manage this over my lifetime? And I think retirement CDC is absolutely a good option for a lot of them. I also think that the design of the retirement income CDCs will take into account some of the work that's been done in, let's say, more the traditional DC land, i.e. the idea of flex and fix. Could you do flex and fix instead of an annuity fix, a retirement income CDC fix? Yeah, why not? I think Willis has mentioned they've been looking at some that on the life size side. So there's a few of those different permutations where I think it kind of, I think it could work. So I haven't quite answered your question. I'm sorry. I think my view is I'd like to see a bit more about what we mean. But what does retirement income CDC look like in the UK? But I can see even in a general purpose, definitely there's a curve coming towards retirement as a default option. That sounds like a really good idea for many people. I think the smaller pots, depending on which day you catch me. Some days I think, well, if the pots are so small, is it really worth trying to spread that over a 30-year period? Are you not better off just using that over a shorter period to, enhance specific points in time, like pay off your mortgage and that kind of thing? But then on the other hand, it's a small pot. You really want to make sure it lasts as long as possible. So I think it's a really difficult position to take at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, a bit of a politician's answer. I try not to do those, but on this one, I'm going to have to do that.
I just want to point people who are interested in how to sack their own proprietor, not that they got one yet. There is one going on between Jane Wolstenholme, I think, from the legal side, from Chris Bunford, who I think is from the actuarial side, and Bobby Ridaway, who's a sort of trustee. So interesting conversation there. I'm not sure whether we're going to come back to that because I have another call and I want it quickly, and that is from Mr. William McGrath.
Hi, I was just going to say there's a lot of money in all those old DB schemes, and I wonder whether you've been thinking about that transfer into CDC and indeed DC, but using the tax system, because the HMT is now on the subject, both with its authorised payments and with the surplus side. So what a great moment to say, look, I tell you what, if you, employer, put the money into your CDC or even DC scheme, you can do that, say, tax-free out of the surplus rather than the 25% tax. So you can see there's big opportunities to get a transfer of value to pump prime all the effort that people are putting into the CDC game.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That sounds like a good idea, I think, perhaps. Look, I think that whole DB to DC, CDC, especially that, I tend to leave that more for the consultant side. I think
Sure.
it's not where I don't have a particularly strong opinion about it. I don't have a particularly great insight into, what's great from a tax perspective. I leave that because I think often, I'm always a bit wary about the tax argument simply because we're probably talking about a particular cohort of people, and for the vast majority, it's just not that big a deal. And I speak for someone who works in an investment management firm, so I think as soon as you look at people with,
But for the sponsors, it could be a lot of dosh.
for the sponsor, it could be. I agree. I think to me, what would be helpful in general would be a cleaner mechanism to have that surplus go towards a DC, CDC, multi-employer. At the moment, it's too favorably stacked towards moving from one trust into the same trust. And I think it's sort of, there's a social good in being able to transfer that surplus across to the to the employer's DC or multi-employer DC that perhaps as a society
an
we're missing.
incentive would help. That was all.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a great way to draw a line under what has been a really great conversation. I thank Massey most of all. Thanks, Marita, for sitting in the background, because I know you've been listening and knocking things down. And let's hope that BlackRock come up with some good ideas over the next year or so as we gestate this thing. Thanks to everyone who's been here, all the questions directly or in the chat. We will be taking all of this down and putting it into a YouTube and sharing it. So if you want to share it with others, that's fine. And I'm now back to Steve, because Steve, you've got some detail on what Playpen is up to, yeah?
Yep. We are running our next coffee morning will be on the 7th of July. We've got Joe Cumbo and Tom McPhail. Ooh, battling it out together in conversation. So that's going to be very exciting. So
they're not going to battle it out. They're on the same side.
I know, but it just sounded good. It just sounded good, to be fair. It just sounded very good. But that should be good. Tom and Joe together in one seminar. So that'd be great. So hope you can all join us on the 7th of July. As usual, we want to pray for peace in the East. It's still going on, but peace in the East, please. And thank you to Massey, thank you to Marita, and thank you to Henry. Thank you for all your questions. The video of today will be up later on at lunchtime, and hope you enjoyed it.
That never is.
Yes, it is. Oh, all right. I'll prove it to you. I'll do it before 12 o'clock. There you go. Done. Okay. Excellent. All right. Enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks a lot, Terry. Thanks a lot, Peter. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
See you later. Right.